What I'd like to do in this first lecture is tell you why you're all here, okay? And to do that, I want to answer the question, why research ethics? And to answer that question, I'd like to go over the history and the principles of research ethics to set the tone for the rest of the lectures for today. Research, doing research involves two goals. And we have to balance two goals. The reason why we do research is first to advance science in order to advance the health of society. But clinical research involves human beings. And hence, we have another goal. We have to protect subject welfare and respect their rights. And we have to balance these two goals and to make sure that our enthusiasm to advance science does not override a concern for the protection of human subjects and respecting their rights. So how well have we done with research in the past 100 years? And when I ask that question, I'd like to take you through, very briefly, the history of research ethics. In the beginning, before the 20th century, research was small scale, involving just very few individuals in each trial. And the intent of all of these trials were therapeutic in nature. And what I mean by that is that before investigators gave a chemical to a human subject, there was a motivation to try to help the patient. Like when they gave a smallpox vaccine to subjects, they took ill patients, and the hope was to try and help that patient. But with the beginning of the 20th century, clinical trials became larger scale, and the intent was to collect systematic data to improve the health of society. And it involved groups of individuals. Unfortunately, most of the time, these groups of individuals were vulnerable. Vulnerable people cannot protect their own interests, and hence they're vulnerable to harms and exploitations. And the types of vulnerable groups we were talking about involve prisoners, orphans, and the mentally ill. These types of people cannot protect their own interests. And the big concern with research protocols in the 20th century was that there was no formal codes of research ethics. Investigators were left to their own discretion. The next defining period in research ethics was World War II, when we have the horrific Nazi experiments. This slide shows an example of the hypothermia experiments. In this slide, we see a prisoner is submerged in a tank filled with cold water. The goal of this type of experiment was to determine how long German pilots would survive after parachuting in the cold North Sea. This next slide shows the high altitude experiments, which were performed to test how long pilots would survive after being ejected from their planes. Prisoners were put into low-pressure tanks with little oxygen. Many of these prisoners died, and those who did not die were put to death in order to perform autopsies. Because of these horrific experiments, after the trial, these doctors were put on trial in 1947, They were put on trial for the murder of concentration camp inmates who were used as research subjects. After the trial, 15 of 23 were found guilty, 7 were hung, and 5 were given life sentences. During the trial, the major question asked was, how could this happen? How could physicians perform these horrific experiments that led to the death of many prisoners? I mean, after all, the German prisoners had sworn to do no harm by the Hippocratic Oath. Was it merely a matter of science being corrupted by politics? The judges, however, asked another question. What is the relevance of the Hippocratic ethics to human experimentation? On one hand, we have medical practice, which is guided by the Hippocratic ethic. The question is it adequate for research to be guided as well by the Hippocratic ethic? On one hand, we have medical practice guided by the Hippocratic Oath, whereby the doctor's primary obligation is to protect and enhance the patient's welfare. Essentially, doctors act in the patient's best interest. However, research really lies outside of the context of the physician-patient relationship. Essentially, investigators have two interests. One is to test a hypothesis in order to advance, ultimately, the health of society. And to be sure, they also have an interest in protecting subject welfare. But sometimes these interests could conflict with each other. So essentially, we have two different types of practices. We have medical practice and we have research practice. With research, we are balancing two goals. And without an adequate framework of research ethics, not medical ethics, but research ethics, the concern is that in some experiments, the advancement of science will override a concern with the protection of subject welfare and respecting their rights. So, the Nuremberg judges did not think, in the context of research, they did not think that the Hippocratic Oath by itself could protect human welfare, and they did not think that the Hippocratic Oath could respect human rights. And hence, they wanted to expand on the Hippocratic ethics in order to protect research subjects. So what they did was they took some part of the Hippocratic Oath, the part that says do no harm, and they added a concept of human rights. And they formulated the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code of 1947 was the first codification of research guidelines, which combined a concept of human rights and protection of the welfare of subjects. The first and longest principle of the Nuremberg Code was the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Article 9 of the Code also concerned human rights. It said subjects have the right to withdraw at any time. Now, the other articles of the Nuremberg Code concern itself with the protection of the welfare of subjects. Every research has to have scientific value. You have to have a favorable risk-benefit ratio, and suffering by subjects should be avoided. This concept of human rights, following the atrocities committed by the Nazis, were incorporated in other documents as well. In 1948, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, consisting of 30 articles outlining the human rights of persons and the violations of those rights. And it included civil and political rights, as well as social, economic, and cultural rights. Now, the Nuremberg Code was just that, just a code. It had several weaknesses. One, it did not have the strength of law. And the researchers in the US did not think that the code applied to them. They thought that ethical conduct was implicit in their work. They thought that science was pure and it was the politics that was corrupt. And hence, medical science should be left on its own without any code and without any laws or regulations. Now, other research guidelines followed the Nuremberg Code. In 1964, we have the Declaration of Helsinki. This declaration involved research that involved patients and medical care. So, essentially, the Nuremberg Code was formulated in response to experiments on prisoners, not patients. The Helsinki document was concerned when research was involved with medical care. The declaration also pointed out regulations for individuals who are not competent to give informed consent. It also made some statements concerning when we have other types of vulnerable individuals participating in research. And the declaration also said that research should be reviewed by an independent review committee. This declaration has undergone several types of revisions, the last one being in 2004. Despite these guidelines and declarations and codes, research abuses continued to occur in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. Henry Beecher was a professor of anesthesiology at Harvard Medical College, and he published an article in 1968 describing 22 examples of abuses in experiments. One experiment withheld antibiotics from patients with rheumatic fever. Another experiment purposefully infected institutionalized children with hepatitis. And another experiment involved injecting live cancer cells into nursing home patients. Essentially, abuses and exploitations of humans in research continued despite having all these codes of ethics. Another example was the Tuskegee Syphilis Study that occurred between 1932 and 1972. Tuskegee is a small town in Alabama, in the US. And in the 1930s, there was a high prevalence of syphilis. And although treatment existed, blacks in the rural southern town were not receiving treatment, either due to a lack of funds or a lack of doctors. And the US public health researchers thought that this would be a good opportunity to study the natural cause of untreated syphilis. So essentially, they enrolled 400 black males who were infected with syphilis in order to study the natural cause of untreated syphilis. And the researchers thought that this was not a research experiment, but merely a study in nature. Well, what were the ethical issues in this study? Well, one, there was inadequate disclosure of information to the subjects. Two, the subjects actually believed that they were getting free treatment. In fact, they were told that the spinal taps was therapy. Here we see a picture of a patient getting therapy. And the US government actively prevented these men from getting penicillin. During World War II, penicillin became available, and every person who was enlisted in the Army got penicillin. In order to preserve this study, the government prevented the black males from enrolling in the Army so that they did not get penicillin. In 1972, when reports of this study was revealed in the newspapers, the US government finally stopped the study. Now, what was the response to all these ethical lapses or research abuses? Well, in 1974, the US Congress passed the US National Research Act. This Research Act codified research principles into national regulations. So now we're not merely dealing with a code, we have something that has the force of law. This Research Act also mandated that all research funded by the US government had to be reviewed by an institutional review board. Essentially, every institution had to set up an IRB. And that was because the thought was that review of research could not be left to the discretion of investigators. This act also appointed a commission that wrote the Belmont Report in 1979. And this Belmont Report is a statement of three ethical principles: autonomy, beneficence, and justice. And in the next few minutes, I would like to